Hi, and welcome back to another AnyRPG Development Livestream. In this series, you can watch the live development of the AnyRPG Engine, a free and open source role-playing game engine designed in Unity and written in C#. If you don't already have a copy of AnyRPG, you can pick one up from anyrpg.org/downloads in both Unity package and source code format. You can also download A Lost Soul, the free playable game that I work on, at the same page. In this episode, I will be continuing the work on the custom character stat system. In the first episode, we added the new character stat class. In the second episode, we turned health into a generic resource so that we can have any stat contribute to it, basically not just stamina. And in this episode, we're going to tackle one of the remaining issues, which is secondary stats. So if we look in our code right now, we've got some red areas right here, and that's because we're trying to set movement speed. And we've got some more issues basically with movement speed, as well as a couple other calculations that have to do with crit chance, basically right here. So right now what I did is in these power enhancer nodes, let's just go to the definition of that and take a look at it. In the power enhancer nodes, we have this stat to crit rating conversion, and we have this stat to power conversion. And this, I want to fix this because basically I want these to be secondary stats, just like movement speed, so we don't have to have a conversion table for each one of them. We'll basically have a conversion node where you choose the secondary stat and then assign it like rating or power, basically. So let's go ahead and do that. Now, right now we've got this hard-coded enum somewhere. Let me just back up until I find it here. If I keep on going back, I will eventually find my enum. There, stat buff type, perfect. So stat buff type used to be for primary stats. If we go to the definition of it here, we see stat buff type. And we had stamina, strength, intellect, and agility defined in it, and then I had sort of like shoehorned in movement speed as an easy way to keep track of it. This is going to be changed. We are going to call this secondary stat type, I think. So let's rename this. And from now on, this keeps track of our secondary stats. We're going to remove stamina, strength, intellect, and agility from it. We're going to have movement speed as a secondary stat. And then let's go through the engine and basically look for other things that are good candidates for secondary stats. So one of the actually, okay, this is great because we're actually in status effect, which is exactly where I wanted to go. So when we apply status effects to our characters, we kind of have like a hard-coded way of doing it right now. So let me just see if I can find the code here. Okay, right here. Basically, this is the code. Okay, we're zoomed in already. Good. So we have buff movement speed. And I want this to basically be like a value that you could choose from a drop-down. We have this stat amount and stat multiplier, which apply to the primary stats, but then we have like hard-coded things for the secondary stats. So we have an outgoing damage multiplier here, which is hard-coded. So I want to make that into a secondary stat. So we'll have basically damage as a secondary stat. We have a speed multiplier, which multiplies your attack speed. So we should have basically speed as a secondary stat. We have this accuracy multiplier, so we can add accuracy as a secondary stat. And then we have this critical strike percent, which is what I was showing earlier, basically with the errors that we still have to fix. So critical strike should basically be a secondary stat as well. So let's go ahead. We'll make accuracy, critical strike, speed, damage, movement speed. All right, so movement speed, accuracy, critical strike, speed, damage. Okay, I think that's good. That's a pretty good amount of secondary stats for now. And let's see, I think there's actually some more that we can make here. In character stats, we actually use this stat class up at the top here to create two stats here, melee damage modifiers and armor modifiers. I'm just thinking, because we're going to be storing like all of our secondary stats in an array anyway, it might be easy just to put these in here. And I'm thinking, like, do we want plus armor as a secondary stat? Well, yeah, I think so, right? Like, I mean, maybe we've got a cloth robe, and the cloth robe is the cloth robe of super hard bulletproof cloth or something, right? And you just want that thing to have like more armor than regular. So I think it makes sense. Plus, we don't have to carry variables around like this. We can carry these around as secondary stats. So why don't we do that? Melee damage modifiers will be a second stat, and armor modifiers will be a second stat. So basically melee damage and armor. Okay, so we'll go into the status effect class. We have like damage, which is like total damage, and speed is like attack speed and casting speed. So we have apparently specifically melee damage. And actually the melee damage secondary stat, there's a good reason for it. Melee damage secondary stat, I believe that's actually controlled by like your weapon damage. So so that's why we have to track melee damage as a separate thing. Okay, so we were doing melee damage, and we were doing one more, we were doing armor. All right. So there, that looks pretty good. I think that's pretty much all the secondary stats that that we need. So movement speed, accuracy, critical strike, speed, damage, melee damage, and armor. Great. So now we've got a much better way than having like these hard-coded lists of all these things. Now we can treat these all basically in the same way. So to do that, where we've got this stuff right here, we need a new header called secondary stats. And let's see, stat buffs and debuffs. Let's call this primary stat buffs and debuffs. We'll move movement speed out of here. Then we'll have secondary stat buffs and debuffs. We'll have secondary stat amount. And secondary stat multiplier. So basically that replaces this, and I'm just going to keep these under here for now because I need to go into the inspector and change all the status effect spells that actually use these things. We'll get rid of that. outgoing damage multiplier is just damage. We need speed, accuracy, critical strike percent. We can pretty much remove the speed heading there. Just add a header here for faction. It's kind of its own thing. Okay, that looks good. So actually we want, these aren't really damage adjustments. Okay, so actually the damage adjustment, we want that the incoming damage modifier here, because incoming damage isn't really a secondary stat, but it is something that we need to keep track of in status effects, because we have like a flat weakness thing which causes us to take extra damage. So we will still track that one separately. Okay, that looks pretty good. So the way that the primary stats work is basically like every primary stat here gets the exact same amount from this. In the secondary stats, we've got that too. I might make this a little more complex. Basically, so what we need to do is we need to just add a list of these. And the logic here was basically like your status effect should only be able to affect one thing at a time. But I might actually make a node here with like an individual amounts and multipliers for each stat buff type. I probably will. For now, I'm just going to put this in here though. This is going to be a list of stat secondary stat type. And we'll call this secondary stat buffs. Buff types. And this is a list of secondary stat type. Okay, that should be good enough for now. And now what we want to do is go to all those places where we were referencing secondary stats like hard-coded and fix that. So we have this primary stat modifiers, which no longer exists. We have character stats, and we need to actually make a new object called secondary stats. So character stats are definable by the user. Secondary stats are hard-coded into the engine because they are like based on some mechanic that's actually written in the code. So this is going to be a dictionary of secondary stat type, secondary stats, yes, and secondary stat type here. And then basically let's just find all references to character stats. And I guess we might as well just calculate the secondary stats. Let's see, if we go to the calculate stat method. Okay, so we'll make a calculate secondary stat method. Calculate secondary stat, and then we will accept a stat secondary stat type. And this will be the secondary stats, and here as well, secondary stats. And then instead of passing in stat name, we'll pass in secondary stat type. And then right here, let's see, we're getting add modifiers. Let's go to that method. Yeah, so we need to basically make a new method called get secondary add modifiers. So we'll call this get secondary add modifiers, accepting a secondary stat type, and here we don't want stat buff type names, we want, and I don't think I exposed secondary stat buff types yet. So quick actions and refactoring, encapsulate it, set this back to protected because Unity just reset it on us, and then we need to go down and make the thing public because Unity will have made it, or C#, I mean, Visual Studio, not Unity, I guess. All right, so now we can go back and this should be secondary stat buff types dot contains secondary stat type. Okay, that looks good. And then if secondary stats dot contains secondary stat type, then return secondary stats secondary stat type dot get value. Okay, good. That'll take care of the add modifiers. So we'll call this from get secondary add modifiers based on the secondary stat type. And then we need to now make a get secondary multiply modifiers based on the secondary stat type. So we'll call get secondary multiply modifiers. We'll go to the definition of get multiply modifiers, and we will make get secondary multiply modifiers. Same as up here, we will accept a secondary stat buff type into this method here. And we don't want stat buff type names, we want secondary stat buff types as the thing we're searching. We're going to look for the secondary stat type. The return value will be, actually the rest of that all looks good. Okay. Good, so now we can calculate secondary stats. So now I think what we need to do is we need to back up a little bit and just keep on backing up here until we get back to the point where we were actually calling those. So let's find all references to calculate stat. There, so we have calculate primary stats. Just going to calculate secondary stats too, because essentially as soon as our primary stats change, then our secondary stats by definition need to change. So here we're going to loop through the secondary stats.keys. So for each secondary stat type, secondary stat type in secondary stats.keys, we want to calculate secondary stat based on secondary stat type. Okay, great. And then let's see, what else do we do here? When we handle status update update. Okay, this is an interesting one. Here, we're calculating a single secondary stat. Or we're calculating a single primary stat. The question is, do we want to run all secondary stat updates? You know what I want to do actually? I want this to be a second method, and I want to be able to call it separately. So we're going to do a public void calculate secondary stats. And we're going to move that logic into there, and then we're just going to call calculate secondary stats from there. So I have two choices right now. Basically, when I call this, I can either loop through the character's power resource nodes, figure out which secondary stats this applies to, and then calculate those one by one. Or I can just go through and basically just ask all secondary stats to recalculate. I think for now I'm just going to do the easy way and just do the second method. The calculation of secondary stats is not a hugely performance affecting thing, and this isn't something that's going to be called like multiple times per second, basically. So it should be okay. So what we'll just do here is just calculate secondary stats. And I'm just going to make a note, maybe in the future loop and only calculate secondary stats that this primary stat affects. Okay, we haven't actually even really added the code for that yet, so though we don't need to do that quite yet. Okay, so that's good. So now let's see what we want to do here. We want to basically get rid of that code which is calling movement speed. So here we set the primary stat modifiers. And then we add the character class modifiers. So now what we should do is we should create the secondary stat modifiers. Now everybody always gets all of the secondary stat modifiers. So pretty much all we need to do is for each and just a second, my C# is failing me here. Loop through a num in C#. Wow. Yeah, I think that'll work. I'm pretty sure that's what I want to do. Okay, a num.getValues returns an array of type enum types. So I want to look for secondary stat type. And we want secondary stat type, secondary stat type. Okay, that's good. All right, and then now what we want to do is basically, instead of character stats.add, we want secondary stats dot add, and in this case what we're going to be adding is the key is secondary stat type, and the value is a new stat. And the stat needs a string for its name. So what we want is basically secondary stat type dot toString, which will give us the string name of that secondary stat. Okay, and now that we have all of our secondary stats, this one right here is a special case. We need to actually handle a movement speed update separately because we're actually passing this onto the InVector controller. So this kind of hard-coded thing right here is going to have to stay, but what we're going to do is we're going to basically look for secondary stats, secondary stat movement speed dot on modifier update equals handle movement speed update. Now this is going to send back a string, so we need to go to handle movement speed update, and we need to basically just accept a string, and this is technically going to be the stat name, the secondary stat name, but we're just going to ignore it. And here, for the calculate run speed, we'll be getting the secondary add modifiers and the secondary multiply modifiers. Okay, let's save that and then let this compile and then go find some more issues here. Okay. So this code right here is run when we change our equipment. And we need to basically, let's see, loop through any modifiers on the item. Now this is interesting because I don't think we actually wrote code for the items yet to hold random stats. Okay, so let's go to the item. And it's on the equipment class here. So we have intellect modifier, stamina modifier, strength modifier, and agility modifier. So we will need to change these. we'll basically need to have a list of nodes with a stat name and a modifier value. So to do that, let's make a header. We'll call it primary stats, and what we want to do is we want to make a new list. So we'll have to create a new serialized field here. And this is going to be a private list of something. Primary stats equals new list of something. Okay, this list of something should be a stat name, so we don't actually need the Boolean. But we do need a Boolean for like whether or not it should be automatic. So this will be a item primary stat node, I guess, for lack of a better name. It's just nice and verbose and easy. So here we'll make a public class item primary stat node. And this is like not inheriting from anything, and it also needs to be system.serializable so that we can set these in the inspector. And our item primary stat node which we can now call here, we'll need a basically, let's just copy all this stuff down here, pull it out, and we'll pull it into the item primary stat node. Okay, so first we'll have a string stat name. And then we will have use manual let's see, use manual value. That looks good. And then we'll just call this manual modifier value. Okay, so we'll add some tooltips here just to let people know. So tooltip. The stat, primary stat, to increase when this item is equipped. By default, this stat will be automatically set based on the item level. Okay, yeah, that's good. All right, and we can add another tooltip there and let people know that if true, the stat value will be the stat value entered in the manual modifier value field will be used instead of the automatically scaled value. And then the manual modifier value. If use manual value is true, let's see, the value in this field will be used instead of the automatically scaled value. Alright, that looks good. So then now we've actually got something that we can set in the inspector that's not hard-coded. And I actually need to add those fields back that I removed. I think it was intellect that I removed. Yeah, intellect. I need to add intellect back because that's stored in the inspector, and I need to go through and retrieve those values. Okay, much better. So let's let that compile and see what other kind of issues we have to solve here. Okay, so on equipment changed. Perfect. So this is where we need to refer to the items modifier based on the primary stat modifiers. Okay, so what we want to do is a for each loop here, and we want to loop through basically everything in the new item dot, and I don't know if I exposed that yet, so let's go back to equipment, and I don't think I did, so we'll encapsulate field here. I actually need to make this back to protected. Because equipment is a base class for other stuff, and then I want to go to that exposed value. It's public. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so now that I have exposed that, I can check through new item dot primary stats, and this gives us a item primary stat node, so we'll be looping through item primary stat nodes. And basically, we can cut that code out right here. We're not using primary stat modifiers, we're just using primary stats. Character stats. You know what I'm thinking? I'm thinking, what line am I on here? 307. Yeah, I'm going to rename that to primary stats, because now that we have secondary stats, it makes a lot more sense. Okay, so primary stats grabbing the item primary stat node dot, and I don't think I exposed any properties on that yet. So quick actions and refactoring, encapsulate that, quick actions and refactoring, encapsulate that. Quick actions and refactoring, encapsulate that. Perfect, and now we can access stat name. So then we're going to add modifier, and the modifier is going to be the, let's see, item primary stat node dot okay, here's an interesting one. This is actually a calculated value. Let's go to the definition of that. Okay, let's see how we're going to handle that here. This is a calculated value based on the character level because we can have scaled equipment. So what we need to do is we basically need to be able to query this by stat name. And let's see, we need to also update this get stamina for level call, because that just needs to be like get like resource, or I mean get like value for level. Everything else in the calculation for what this value should be is okay. So let's do that. We'll make a new public virtual int, and we're going to call this get primary stat modifier. We're going to send in the string stat name, and then we need to basically check if that exists in any of the nodes, the stat nodes for this item. Given how, let's see, this method could actually be called quite frequently, because essentially this is going to be used as part of like, actually, is this called real time or not? I'm thinking whether it's just going to be quicker, or I mean like more effective, just to make a dictionary of like primary stat modifier to stat nodes during the startup of this item. Or I think for now we'll just do the loop thing though. So basically, let's just go through. So we're going to need to do a for each loop, and we're going to loop through the primary stats. And that will let us loop through item primary stat nodes. let's make a Boolean here. And we're just going to call this use modifier equals false. And if at any point we find that the stat name that we passed in is equal to the item primary stat node dot stat name, then we're going to set use modifier equal to true, and then if not, use modifier, then return 0. Okay, good. So then if use okay, just a second. You know what we need to do here? Essentially, it's entirely possible due to the way these nodes are set up in the inspector for you to add like intellect twice. So I think we'll have to change the way that this code is done. What we'll do is we'll hit Control X, we'll cut all that out. We'll just straight up return 0 at the end of that. Here, we'll put all that code in the middle of here, because this will just cause us to return out on the first match. If we didn't find a match, then we do this. So basically what we want to do then is we don't even need that, and this is just like the default return. Okay, that looks good. So now we can, let's see, properly get our Stanya. Okay, so this should actually say if item primary stat node dot use manual modifier value. Use manual value. Oh, this is protected. It needs to be public. Okay, then we're going to return the manual item primary stat node dot manual modifier. Okay, good. Otherwise, now we need to do some level equations stuff. Okay, so what we need to do here is basically this get stamina for level call. We need to switch that up. Wow, that can't be right. Every single modifier is calling get stamina for level. That kind of seems like a serious bug, to be totally honest. Anyway, let's go look at that, get stamina for level. Yeah, I think that's a bug because I have all these other ones here. I don't think I ever really noticed that. So here, we're going to make get primary stat for level instead of get stamina for level. So get primary stat for level, and we need to send in the string stat name, and then the level and the character class. So we'll have int extra stat per level. Actually, you know what I'm just going to do? I'm just going to rename that, and then that way I don't have to change all of them. Okay, so here we're calling extra stat per level equals character class dot my stamina per level. What we want to do is change that up and say if character class dot, let's see, primary stats dot and actually, you know what, I think we actually need to loop through those. So we want to go through for each. And what's this returning us? A stat scaling node. Stat scaling node in character class dot primary stats. And then our stat scaling node has the stat name. Perfect. So what we want to do is basically if the stat scaling node dot stat name is equal to the stat name that we passed into the function, then our extra stat per level is equal to that, and then we're just going to break out of this loop because we should only ever have one of these basically. So then let's see what else here. Okay. Here, we're looking for the System Configuration Manager's base stat budget per level for this stat, so that we need to actually go through and grab that as well. So we have extra stat per level, and we need extra extra system stat per level, basically. So why don't we actually rename this to extra class stat per level? Just comment that out so the compiler doesn't complain here. So this is extra class stat per level. We'll apply that, and then we need extra system stat per level. So then here we want to basically run this for each loop in the System Configuration Manager dot my instance dot primary stats, and we'll do the exact same thing, except for we will add this value to extra system stat per level. And now we can finally get rid of this and replace this with extra system stat per level. And this is a float, so this is an int. I'm going to just cast that to a float as well. Okay, that should work. So now we finally have a way to get generic primary stats for the level through our level equations. And now we can back all the way up to wherever this was called from, right here, and call get primary stat for level. sending in our stat name. Okay, awesome. And now we can save that, and I think we can back up even further to wherever we were previously calling get stamina for level. Right here. Perfect. So now what we can do is grab the new item dot get primary stat modifier, and based on the item primary stat node dot stat name the level and the base character. Excellent. And now we can get rid of all of those hard-coded values right there, and we have no more assumptions about what stats are on equipment. Okay. Similarly, we will want to do the same thing when we remove it. So let's just copy this code right here and just make sure we can call remove modifier. Okay, that looks good as well. Interesting thing right here, I just realized there's actually a bug in my code right here. Let's actually just make a note of that. There's a a bug here. If you equip an item at one level, then remove it at another level, it will remove the higher level value for the stat, leaving you with less stats than you should have. To fix this, we need to recalculate the add or the modifiers for armor, or I mean for equipment every time you level up. And actually, to be totally honest, I think maybe, I'm not sure if this is done actually. I'm gonna have to check that. I'm gonna have to check if scaling armor actually has this bug, because I think that it does have that bug potentially. So okay, great. So now we fixed that on equipment change. So let's go back here and let it compile, and let's see. We got our power enhancer node here, and we need to change this. We have a list of character stat to crit node and character stat to power node. So basically what we want to do is we want to adjust this so that I think we'll just have a character stat to secondary stat node. Let's try that out. So our tooltip here will be convert primary stats to secondary stats, and it will be called the primary to secondary conversion, I guess. And we'll make a new type of node for it. And this node will be called a primary to secondary stat node. And let's see. In the primary to secondary stat node, we need to list the primary stat name. We need to choose the secondary stat type. And the name of the secondary stat to convert this resource into. Here we need two types of things. We need basically a direct conversion ratio. The stat is multiplied by this amount when converting, or basically the primary stat is multiplied by this amount when converting it to the secondary stat. And then we also need rated conversions, the same way we do with critical strike. And I actually thought of a better way to explain rated conversions. So I think what I want to do is basically you can have a direct conversion or a rated conversion. You can't have both. So I'm just going to do this the cheap way. I could make an enum for this, but for now I'm just going to do it super cheap way. And what I'm going to do is basically, by default, it's direct, and if we have this bool checked, it's going to be a rated conversion equals false by default. And I'll explain how a rated conversion here works. A rated conversion is for stats that are percentages. At any given level, okay, let's just see. at level 1, you need 100 points of this secondary stat for 100%. $200 points at level 2, etc. I think that's kind of clear, basically. The percent chance at any level is equal to this value multiplied by whatever. This allows you to increase or decrease the 100 point requirement for 100% chance, basically. So essentially, if your stat to crit rating ratio is like 2, then you'll need like 200 points, and if it's like 0.5, you'll need like 50 points, which just makes it easier for you to reach 100% of a rated stat, pretty much. So I think that's good. That's pretty much everything that we should need for the primary to secondary stat conversion node. So now we just want to go and expose all these properties here. And this should say conversion ratio. Actually, and this should say stat rating ratio. And since this is a float, this should be 0f, and since this is a float, this should be 0f. Okay, and then we just need to expose this. Okay, and now that we have this primary to secondary stat node, we can, I think, back up, find the place where we were calling these other things, and this is now a primary to secondary stat node and primary to secondary stat node. Okay. These won't be needed anymore. I'm going to keep them there because I need to copy some properties out of the inspector, though, in order to make sure that I don't lose those values. So we'll keep that for now. And then we'll need to expose this. So quick actions and refactoring, encapsulate field. All right, and now I believe we want to keep on going back to wherever we were calling this from, right here. So get crit chance for character. Crit chance modifier plus equals power enhancer node dot all right. So here we need to do a loop and add all of these things. So we need another for each loop. We're going to be looping through the power enhancer node dot primary to secondary conversion, which gives us a primary to secondary stat node. We'll call this the primary to secondary stat node. And then let's see here. if our okay, just a second. So what do we need to do here? We have our primary secondary stat node. We need to first check, this is crit chance. So we need to first check if, first of all, the primary to secondary stat node dot secondary stat type is equal to secondary stat type dot critical strike. All right, and then if it is, we basically want to copy this code in here and basically we have two ways to calculate it. This is the rated conversion right here, and this is the non-rated conversion. So we have to check, first of all, if this is a rated conversion or not. So if our primary to secondary stat node dot rated conversion is true, then we'll do that. Else, we'll do something more like this. Okay, great. Now we can get rid of all those hard-coded values. And here, we'll be grabbing the primary to secondary stat node dot, and this is the rated one, so it's not my stamina to crit per level, it's the stat rating ratio. In this case, we're not grabbing my stamina. We're grabbing the character stats. Okay, we need to grab from the character stat the primary stats. Which I don't know if we've even exposed. We'll need to grab basically from the primary stats the stat name, which is in the primary to secondary stat node dot stat name. So let's see here. I'm just going to write that value out. Primary to secondary stat node with a lowercase p dot stat name. So we want to actually go to character stats and expose our primary stats dictionary. Let me just confirm that we haven't actually done that. No, we exposed our power resource dictionary. We have not exposed primary stats, so we're going to encapsulate that, and then we're going to set this to protected. Might as well do the same thing with secondary stats and then set this to protected. Now we can go back to that code where we were calling this, and we can find primary stats with this as the key. And I believe we want actually current value here. Okay, otherwise, and this isn't, yeah, I guess this is crit chance modifier. We're doing like a generic version of this right now. Honestly though, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, I'm going to finish the logic for get crit chance for character, but because this is now an entirely generic method, I'm going to basically copy it and do like get whatever, just like get generic secondary stat for character, pretty much. Okay, so let's finish this up. Here we will instead use this value, the primary to secondary stat node, and not stat rating ratio, but stat, what properties are available to us here again? Direct conversion ratio. Yeah, there. And then similarly, instead of grabbing my stamina, we need to grab this node's value, basically, for whatever actual conversion this was. Okay, now here we have get critical strike modifiers. Let's go and take a look at that, because this code will need to be updated. Okay, so here I think I want to make a second copy of this and just call it like get secondary stat modifiers. And let's just hit Control F, make sure I haven't already created something with that name. Nothing. Okay, good. So here we should accept a secondary stat type. And let's see, we're looping through the status effect nodes. If status effect node dot my status effect dot, and we've got this whole secondary stat buff types. Which gives us a list of secondary stat type. So basically we want to do dot contains the secondary stat type that we're searching for. Then our return value is going to be and here we're not grabbing extra critical strike percent. We're grabbing okay, I think I need to expose a property. Let's just go take a look at this. Yeah, okay, so I need to quick actions refactoring and encapsulate field secondary stat amount, and quick actions and refactoring encapsulate field secondary stat multiplier. And let's make those public. And in fact, if I just did that, then that means Unity went and made those private again. And I want them protected. Or C# Visual Studio made them private. Okay, good. So now we have access to secondary stat multiplier and secondary stat amount. So in here, this is an amount, basically. So this is secondary stat amount. And we need to somehow calculate the modifiers as well. Basically the secondary stat multipliers. So technically this is get secondary stat add modifiers, which is important. Just a second, I think that might actually be in use somewhere. No? Okay, good. Because basically what we'd want to do is get all the secondary stat add multipliers and then multiply that by the total of all the secondary stat multiply modifiers. Okay, in the meantime, let's actually just deal with get critical strike modifiers for now. So here, we'll basically just use the exact same logic. Except for this will be secondary stat type dot critical strike. And this will be my status effect dot secondary stat amount. Okay, that's good. Now I think we need to back up to wherever we were calling get critical strike modifiers from. Which was right here. And then what I wanted to do was make a generic one for this. And make it get secondary stat for character. And we were going to pass in the secondary stat type and the base character. Instead of accepting critical strike, we'll just accept the secondary stat type from here. We're going to just rename this to return value. And here, instead of calling get critical strike modifiers, we will be calling get secondary stat add modifiers, sending in the secondary stat type. Okay, let's back up a little further to where we were calling this whole level equations thing in the first place. Let's see if I can find where we were calling that. Okay, let's see. You know what? Let's just jump back into Unity and just look for some errors here. Let it compile and then just go follow the issues. Okay, so let's see. We've got this issue right here. Handle change notifications. This is a bit of a hard-coded thing. We actually do need this to happen here. We need to calculate movement speed. So here, I think we need to do a for each loop, and we need to be looping through the status effect dot, we want the lowercase status effect dot secondary stat buff types, which will give us secondary stat type. So secondary stat type, secondary stat type, and oh, you know what? We don't even have to do a loop. Basically, if secondary stat buff types dot contains secondary stat buff type dot movement speed. Okay, perfect. Then go ahead, calculate run speed. Okay, good. That's one issue. We've got another one here. Okay. This is our primary stat value update. This is like the absolute core of what we've been trying to get to so far. This is the point at which we set our level and we calculate all of these values based on our character's level. So what we'll need to do is we'll need to go through a, just a second. I'm calling calculate primary stats right here. Honestly, I think that's actually contains all the code for this. Let's just go check. Basically, we should get current level times get stat for level. So let's go to the definition of that. Let's go to the definition of that. Okay, so what we're calculating right here is the base value plus add modifiers times multiply modifiers. So base plus add times multiply. Here we're calculating the base itself. So this is actually kind of technically calculating the current. So we still need to do this, but it needs to happen after this when we calculate the base. So let's actually just make a note of that. First, we are calculating base values independent of any modifiers. Then we are calculating current values that include modifiers. Okay, and actually this actually happens on level up, and so that bug that I was talking about where your scaling gear isn't giving you stuff, I don't think that bug actually exists because I think this actually handles that use case. So let's go through and calculate these base values. So we'll need to do something like this. Why don't we actually make that a method called calculate base primary stats, maybe? And we need to actually do something about these multipliers too, because unit toughness, we will need to actually include primary stat modifiers in unit toughness because these stats are no longer hard-coded. And in fact, health multiplier and mana multiplier will actually need to be changed out as well for like resource multipliers. So first though, we're going to put this code down there. We're going to do calculate base primary stats. We are going to send in modifiers. We're not even going to send in modifiers. You know what? This is the calculate base primary stats. We don't need to have that up there. I'm just going to, yeah, we'll just have this loop right here. So loop. And apparently YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain smooth streaming, so I apologize for that. Alright, so then let's go look at this calculate stat code, and we'll set the base value. So basically we'll pull that out and we'll say we don't need to do this check because that check is already part of that for each loop. And here we want to set the base value. Alright, so our base value should be equal to something like this. And this is where we no longer need get stamina for level. We need get primary stat for level, sending in the stat name, and here we just need to not use used stamina multiplier. So let's figure out what to do about the multipliers. We're going to need to go into unit toughness. Okay, just a second. Health multiplier is not even used. Just Control Z here for a second. Was I ever using health multiplier? I was never using health multiplier. Oh, you know what? Health multiplier is a global. Yeah, that's why. Okay, that's fine. So Control Y to redo. All right, and then now we need to go get these multipliers. So we need to actually make a list here, more like a dictionary. With all the multiplier values. Okay, so we'll make a new dictionary of string what is this? This is a float. Dictionary of string float. And this new dictionary of string float will be called multiplier values. And it's a new dictionary of string float. And then we'll fill it up with entries. So multiplier values dot add stat name 1f. And then here we can grab multiplier values with a key of stat name. Okay, great. Now we don't need these anymore. And let's see, that was old code that I don't need. So now what we need to do is we now need to go into the unit toughness and add some multiplier nodes, basically. So let's go to the definition of unit toughness. And here's our multipliers. Stat multipliers. These are going to be resource multipliers, and these will be stat multipliers. And here we'll actually need a list, and we'll need to make some kind of serialized node again. So this will be a private list of something called stat, primary stat multipliers. And that's going to be a new list of something. So let's go make that. We will make a new system.serializable, and this is a public class, and this is going to be, let's see, a primary stat multiplier node. We'll have a new serialized field on it, and it will be a private string stat name. Add a tooltip. The name of the stat to multiply. And then we'll add another tooltip here. And a serialized field, and basically variable like that, except for it's going to say stat multiplier. Then all we need to do is quick actions and refactoring and encapsulate those two things. Hello, stat multiplier, encapsulate, good. So the value to multiply the stat by a value of 1 means no change. A value of 1, how about will result in no change, or in the stat staying the same. Okay, great. So now I'm going to keep these because I'm going to need to copy all the unit toughness values that I have already set up into this new thing. So this is now a list of primary stat multiplier nodes. And we can quick action and refactoring, and we can encapsulate that and save it, and then we can go back to wherever we were calling unit toughness from. Just keep on hitting back here until I get to the right spot. There. So we have a list of nodes. So what we need to do is go through all the primary stat multiplier nodes in unit toughness dot primary stat multipliers and add to the dictionary, so multiplier values, yeah, there. And we want to set based on the primary stat multiplier node dot stat name, and we want to set its value to the primary stat multiplier node dot stat multiplier. Okay, now we can get rid of all those. And that should just work. Okay, so now we've no longer got stat calculations hard-coded into character stats here. Let's just back out, go back into Unity here, and just see how many more issues we've got. Plenty of them still. So I don't think spell power for character is needed anymore. Really. Maybe it is kind of. So let's see here. Yeah, we kind of do need it, because basically we get my power to spell damage. Okay, so let's copy that loop from above in here. And here we have dot power. I think damage is what we called it. Yeah, I think damage is the right one here. Basically, that was the equivalent of power. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set the total damage modifier plus equal to the stat rating ratios, or the stat value ratios. Looks pretty good, and then I think I can just get rid of all that. Okay, I think that'll work for the spell power. And then we'll want to do pretty much the exact same thing for the physical power, because basically the physical power uses the stat node's power value and then checks whether or not we're supposed to convert that into physical damage. So we can basically just take all that stuff out here and replace it all with that. Okay, that's not bad. We're starting to get down on the number of issues here. So here we'll need to do some sort of for loop. So we're going to be looping through the stat to resource node and one of its subproperties. I think stat conversion, yeah. And that will give us a list of character stat to resource nodes. So this is a list of character stat to resource node. Call it character stat to resource node. All right, now what we want to check is this character stat to resource node has some properties. And basically what we want to do is we want to take the return value plus equals the character stat to resource node dot resource per point multiplied by the character stats dot primary stats and my is the current value, and the key is the character stat to resource node dot stat name. And then we just put a semicolon at the end of that. And now we've got the same calculation that was down there, and we can remove all those hard-coded values. We'll let that compile, and now we are down to 4 issues. My intellect modifier no longer needed. My stamina modifier no longer needed. My strength modifier no longer needed, and my agility modifier no longer needed. Let's save that. Okay, so this is the description when we're doing like our mouse overs. And so what we want to do is, because we're not using these hard-coded values, we pretty much just want to loop through the primary stat modifiers and then display those. So let's go ahead and do that. That means we'll need a for each loop, and the equipment has primary stats, I believe. Item primary stat node. Yes, so we're going to be looping through a list of item primary stat nodes called item primary stat node. And what we want to do is plus 0 and then 1. And for the 1, we want it to be the item. Do you know what I'm going to do? This is like going way off the screen here. Why don't we just make that a little easier to see? So we want the item primary stat node dot stat name, So that's going to be the value in number 1, and then the value here, we need to get the primary stat modifier. Okay, so we'll call get primary stat modifier. Yeah, perfect. And we will send in the item primary stat node dot stat name, and then the rest of those values. And what is this complaining about? Format string contains invalid placeholder. I think I have like an extra bracket somewhere. There we go. Yeah, I had an extra bracket. Okay, and then I need one more ending bracket there. Okay, that's better. All right, so then we can get rid of all these hard-coded values. And now we will dynamically show any stats available to our equipment. Let's go back into Unity. Let it compile. And you can tell this is a pretty big change. It's got a lot to do here. It's still compiling basically. It's probably linking a lot of files or something like that because we changed so much with this change. Yeah, it's still going. There we go. Now we're done. Wow, the memory jumps to like 18 gigs. Okay, cool. This is great. So finally, for the first time in like the last 4 hours, we actually have something, or we can probably look at our, this is going to be the warrior character class. Okay, awesome. We can look at all of our stats again. So I think now that we have that working, and basically we've gotten rid of all the issues and the errors in the inspector, what I'm going to do is, I think that's good enough for this episode. We've got basically secondary stats built in. You know what? Let's actually just do some secondary stats real quick. So here, we're calculating strength to power at 0.5. So let's calculate strength to, this is power, it's not crit rating, so basically strength to damage at a direct conversion ratio of 0.5. Perfect. And then let's add a second one. Oh, you know what? I think I actually have to move this power to spell damage and power to physical damage. I'm going to have to remove that. It's going to have to go somewhere else, basically. Okay, but for now, let's just try the second one here. So basically now we're going to do agility, and agility is going to increase your critical strike at a stat to conversion ratio also of 0.5. So we actually want a rated conversion instead, and we'll do stat rating ratio 0.5. I think it actually makes sense that maybe I can just have this as conversion ratio, and then if we check rated conversion, then it'll not be direct, because it doesn't really make sense. Like, you can do one or the other, so I probably shouldn't have those values there twice. This is kind of interesting. What I might end up doing is instead of damage, I might have damage, melee damage, and spell damage all separate, I think. And then it would make sense basically that way you could choose whether this is going to like all damage or just melee damage or just spell damage. And I think that actually makes more sense. Because that way, like, these boxes right here only apply if that was a damage that we're choosing as the secondary stat, and we can choose anything. So I think that makes a lot more sense to do it that way. We'll have damage, melee damage, spell damage, and you can just choose both or either or none. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'm happy with that. This episode's getting a little long. We're like 2 hours now, so I think we're going to do a part 4 where we'll come back and finish the character stat system. And now that it's working again, we can just basically go through and do like all the final testing and all the little final tweaks, and just make sure that we don't have any logic errors in the code and everything works as intended. So I hope that you have enjoyed that so far, and if you did, don't forget to thumbs up the video, subscribe to AnyRPG, or just leave a note in the comments. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time.